I would also acknowledge the sovereignty of First Nations people to these ancient lands has never been ceded or surrendered. As well, I extend my respects to anyone of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage who is with us today in the seminar. You'll hear quite a lot today about the special place that's the Yellingbo Nature Conservation Area. Yellingbo falls within the local government area of the Shire of Yarra Ranges. And it's my very great pleasure to invite the Mayor of the Shire of Yarra Ranges, Councillor Fiona McAllister, to formally open this event. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you also for your beautiful, very beautiful, moving acknowledgement of country as well. And I too would like to start by saying I'm very proud to have been born on the land of the Ngāi Tahu in Aotearoa, and very grateful to live on the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Yarra Valley, and also respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people, as the custodians of this land, and pay my deepest respects to all Aboriginal community elders, past, present and emerging, who have been and always will be an integral part of the history of this region. I'd like to say a big thank you and acknowledge all the friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater and friends of Leadbeater's Possum who are here today. Zoos Victoria Helmeted Honeyeater Recovery Team member and authority on Leadbeater's Possum, Dan Harley, who we'll hear from later on. Our expert panellists, including Professor Paul Sunux, N. Smales, Bruce Quinn, Dr. Melanie Birchnell, Gay Gadsden, Sue Tardif, Casey Melfi and Steve Meacher. I guess you're starting to realise we've got a pretty amazing group of panellists we're going to be hearing from today. And of course, to all of you turning up from far and wide, I think from the various parts of the globe actually today, who are all equally passionate about our beautiful state emblems. And of course, a thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And as Alan mentioned, my name is Fiona McAllister. I'm the Ryrie Ward Councillor, meaning I'm zooming in from Healesville in the beautiful Yarra Valley, and I am the Mayor of Yarra Ranges. And today we're here to talk about our beloved state faunal emblems. In this year, that is the 50th anniversary of the proclamation of our faunal emblems, the Helmeted Honeyeater and the Leadbeater's Possum, two animals that we're incredibly lucky to have in this beautiful corner of the world. Aside from being our Victorian faunal emblems and residents of the Yarra Ranges, unfortunately, the other thing that these two special animals share is that they're both critically endangered. The final categorisation step before an animal is declared extinct in the wild and extinct. Thankfully for all of us, there is an incredible amount of work being done by volunteers, by experts and government agencies to stop the decline and turn things around. At Council, we have a goal of protecting, enhancing, restoring populations and habitat for Indigenous flora and fauna wherever possible. And part of this role is working with land managers, community and environmental groups and government to make this happen, supporting them wherever we can. Another is making sure that we manage land to protect and enhance biodiversity wherever possible. For our faunal emblems, we've seen some incredible work in this space. And we're proud to be a member of the Helmeted Honeyeater Recovery Team. And we value the contribution we're able to make, working with such a dedicated group to save the species, identifying ways we can support and enhance their work. Our Ribbons of Green program has been using the Friends of Helmeted Honeyeaters nursery to supply plants for the program since 2008. And we look forward to continuing this work for many years to come. Our Ribbons of Green teams also work closely with partner organisations such as the Beyond Yellingbo project to restore and enhance habitat for helmeted honeyeaters on private land near Yellingbo. In other parts of council, we've received funding through DELP's biodiversity response planning to undertake critical deer control and weed control to positively impact hee-ho habitat. And of course, a key priority in our council plan that is in its final draft stages is Yarra Ranges Council's biodiversity strategy. Of course, these are a small component of the broader picture of conservation efforts for these two species. The heart and soul of much of the work in saving them comes from the dedication and tireless commitment of volunteers, for which we're all eternally grateful. So today is bittersweet, the sweetness of celebrating 50 years this year of our faunal emblems, and the preciousness and beauty of these animals and the incredible body of work that is being done to protect them, and the heartfelt understanding that there is still a lot of work to be done. There are, however, many successes to be celebrated and pause to be grateful for. The growing hee-ho populations in Yellingbo bring hope and optimism. The wonderful work and dedication of the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeaters, Friends of the Leadbeater's Possum, Zoos Victoria, and all the other groups and agencies that participate in the work that is being done. We are grateful for the shifts in policy and environmental awareness that get us closer to stable and safe populations of these very special creatures. So for me and my fellow councillors and all at Yarra Ranges Council, I say thank you to you all from a place of gratitude, hope and optimism that my children and their children will be part of a world shared with our two state emblems, the Helmeted Honeyeater and the Leadbeater's Possum. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be part of it. And I know we have a wonderful panel to sit back and enjoy. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that great launch, Fiona. Fiona is an incredibly hardworking councillor, and we at the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater really appreciate the very close partnership that we have with the Yarra Ranges Council. Before introducing our keynote speaker, there are a few housekeeping matters that probably need attention. This is a large audience, so any questions you might have will need to be put into the chat function, which I'm sure everyone's now quite familiar with. This is a very compressed symposium. Our last one 2 years ago was in person and went for a full day. So there's no guarantee we'll be able to come to your question. There will not be questions immediately after the keynote address, and those questions, those that can be, will be dealt with in the panel session, which Dan will be joining. So before introducing our keynote speaker, please join with me and I think be enthralled with the wonderful piece of paradise that is Yellingbo, and be introduced to our wonderful avifaunal emblem of Victoria and those, or some of those, who are working to protect it.
The helmeted honeyeater is a absolutely lovely bird. When you see it in nature, it just is so magical to see it.
It's kind of just a wonder. Like when I first saw the helmeted honeyeater in the wild, I stood there and was like, wow. And I don't think photos translate the beauty of what the helmeted honeyeater is and what it stands for. But when you see it in the bush and you know that they're really critically endangered, it's just like an amazing moment. And they're a very special bird, hence why we're trying to protect it.
In the 1950s, a group of community members just determined that this bird was in decline. The population was really plummeting. In the 1960s, this reserve system was set aside. This was a stronghold for the Helmeted Honeyeater.
Yellingbow Nature Conservation Reserve is a really special place for a whole heap of reasons.
Okay, cool.
We have a cut.
Yeah. And some Buscapan.
I'll grab that, and then I'll have to go up and
I think that will, there was a little bit more to come, but I think you've got the flavour of what is happening at Yellingbow among some people, and also the amazing cinematography of Angus Hamilton. My next task is to introduce our keynote speaker. When it came to showcase the past, present and future of the two state emblems, one name immediately sprang to mind, and that name is Dan Harley, or more correctly, Dr. Dan Harley. And the doctor is quite apposite in this event, because Dan's doctoral thesis was entitled The Life History and Conservation of Leadbeater's Possum, Gymnobolidius leadbeateri, in lowland swamp forest. Since this groundbreaking doctoral research, Dan has been monitoring Leadbeater's possums for over 20 years. This includes leading nest box research on the possum at several highland locations, including sites built on Black Saturday at Lake Mountain and Mount Bullfinch. Dan joined Zoos Victoria in 2010, and his role includes identifying which species require urgent management interventions, developing the strategy objectives for those species, and ensuring that the captive breeding programs are strongly linked with in situ recovery measures. In this role, Dan is a leading member of the Helmeted Honeyeater recovery team, which oversees the recovery plan for the Helmeted Honeyeater. So over to you, Dan.
Sure. Thank you, Alan. I'll just try to share my screen, everybody. So can you all see that? Thumbs up. Beautiful. Thanks, Fiona. So I would like to start also by acknowledging the traditional owners on the various lands on which we're gathered. I'm on Wurundjeri land here in Healesville, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also really look forward to the day, as I'm sure we all do, where we can all gather in one place again, and hopefully that's not too far away. But I hope you're all enjoying the good cold, wet, awesome weather outdoors. Leadbeaters love these sorts of conditions. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is really try to provide an overview of population condition and the conservation strategies underway for both the Helmeted Honeyeater and Leadbeater's possums. There are some similarities between the two species and some quite pronounced differences. For the Helmeted Honeyeater, there has been some really significant progress over the past 5 years. And in contrast, despite much effort, the story for Leadbeaters is not quite so straightforward. I'd also like to acknowledge at the outset the recovery teams and the many people that have contributed to the ideas and the themes that I'll touch on throughout this talk. But we're going to start with some time travel. And so I'd ask everyone to close their eyes and imagine the year is 1750. All of the valley floors and the floodplains from Healesville to Western Port Bay have forest cover. The paperbark swamps are extensive. There's water flowing in all of the creeks. Now hold that image and now envisage how abundant and how widespread you think helmeted honeyeaters and leadbeater's possums once were. Where did they occur, and what might those populations have looked like? All right. Really, the key point I want to make with that is that these species were once widespread and common throughout their range. I think there's a trap that we sometimes fall into associated with shifting baselines. And our baseline for many threatened species starts in the 1970s. And so we sometimes act like these species were always rare and they were always vulnerable, but there's much evidence to suggest that wasn't always the case, and that it's actually our actions that have made them rare. A really interesting historical note that links these two species is that the helmeted honeyeater was almost named Leadbeater's honeyeater. So Frederick McCloy from the Victorian Museum published a description naming it Tylotus leadbeateri. However, on the same day, John Gould published a description calling it Tylotus cassidix. Like, what are the odds? Same day. Gould's description was accompanied with an illustration, and so the laws of taxonomy meant that that was the accepted description. I think the other thing is it's not the most flattering depiction of a leadbeaters in McCoy's original description. But, you know, working on both of these species, it strikes me as very fitting that both of them are among Victoria's faunal emblems. And it often strikes me that really since the time of their first discovery, both of them down near the Bass River, their stories have almost weaved back and forth with sort of touch points, you know, a bit like floodplain forests on which they rely. When lowland leadbeater's possums were first discovered at Yellingbo in 1986 by Ian Smales, who we're lucky to have on the panel, you know, he was actually working on helmeted honeyeaters at the time. So there are many connections between these two species. Leadbeater's possum is already a victim of climate change. So based on subfossils, this was the extent of its distribution 20,000 years ago. And this is the extent of its current distribution, a 70 by 95 kilometre area. For leadbeater's populations, it's really important to distinguish the two genetic groups. So that large blue shaded area represents the range of highland leadbeater's possums that occupy the montane ash forest and subalpine woodlands throughout the Central Highlands. And then the small outlying blue dot is the lowland population inhabiting the swamp forest of Yellingbo. So through this presentation, my leadbeater's focus will largely be focused on that lowland population, given the overlap with helmeted honeyeater. But towards the end, I'll make a couple of brief observations on the highland population and the future. And I'm sure Steve Meacher actually will provide some further comment during the discussion that follows. So the cleared area in this map shows the historic range of the helmeted honeyeater and lowland leadbeaters towards Western Port Bay and southwest Gippsland. Very little retained vegetation cover in that area. And really, you know, the history of these species overlaps not only at Yellingbo, but also at these historic sites. Now, you know, these are locations that have been cleared for more than a century, and it's a history that is not well understood and is, you know, in many respects largely forgotten. So we only have glimpses into this past. The other feature of this map is the large area of dark green towards the top is the range of highland leadbeater's possum. The limited amount of suitable habitat is still the key limiting factor that restricts our ability to recover populations of these two species. Less than 1% of the floodplain forests occupied by these species remain intact. And so the outcome of that historic clearing is that aside from Yellingbo and possibly Bunyip, there are no large intact patches of these habitats within the historic range of these two animals, which is shown by the red here. Conversely, these vegetation communities once covered extensive areas. So the Great Swamp near Kuirup once stretched over 70,000 hectares. To put that into context, Cockatoo Swamp at Yellingbo covers just 180 hectares. So these habitats weren't rare, and it's pretty reasonable to assume the populations of the two species were abundant throughout. The key current vulnerability for helmeted honeyeaters and lowland leadbeater possums has been the confinement of the last wild populations to a single location at Yellingbo, where the two co-occur. We have no risk spreading against bushfire. This is what Highland leadbeater possum habitat at Lake Mountain looked like following Black Saturday. And it really highlights that circumstances can change overnight. It's range restricted species such as these that are at the greatest risk of extinction through these catastrophic events. And I think the key point is that there's no room for complacency. For helmeted honeyeaters, we lost the cockatoo and the Upper Beaconsfield populations following the Ash Wednesday bushfires. So fire has played a big role, for both of these species in the past. The other notable thing about fire that, features in many conversations, it has the capacity to both destroy and create habitat. So we have swampy sites near Marysville that are regenerating from Black Saturday. So this is one of them here. And 10 years on, some of these sites have been recolonized by yellow tufted honeyeaters and leadbeater possums. But ecology is messy. So the more recent bushfires at Bunyip, which is a wetter system than those northern areas around Marysville, don't seem to have stimulated the same regeneration response in the vegetation. And it seems, that the floodplain communities have been negatively impacted by recent fires there. At Yellingbo, as has been a point of discussion for a long time, there's been marked decline in the condition of the swamp forest for a whole host of reasons, some tied to altered hydrology. We have senescence in the mid-story vegetation, so the paperbarks and tea trees. We have a lack of seedling recruitment, particularly with some of the eucalypts, due to altered disturbance processes, and then more recently, deer damage and browsing by mammals. For the helmeted honeyeater, given that context, supplementary feeding has proven to be a really powerful and effective tool to compensate for that reduced habitat quality. And I think it's really important to note the amazing work that the Friends of Helmeted Honeyeater and DELP have both done, to maintain the feeding regime at Yellingbo, particularly during the past 12 months, under very trying circumstances. And that feeding regime has worked. So the honeyeater population size has increased from about 50 birds, where we were really stuck around 2009, 2010, 2011. And that increase has taken us right up to 250 birds. So the largest number since this recovery effort commenced, more than 30 years ago. I think that population increase provides a really inspiring example of what we can achieve when we combine, strategy and science alongside partnerships and persistence. The other really important component to the recovery program for the helmeted honeyeater is the captive breeding program underway at Hillsville Sanctuary. It also has been running for more than 30 years, and over that time, more than 400 honeyeaters have been bred, a large number of which have been released to the wild. The captive breeding story for leadbeaters is not so encouraging. So over the past 10 years at Hillsville Sanctuary, we've been attempting to breed lowland leadbeaters, but haven't successfully managed to do so, despite a huge amount of effort. And so the captive diet has been improved significantly, and the current focus with the captive leadbeaters program is to test the husbandry methods and attempt to breed some Highlands leadbeaters possums that were collected from the wild during 2019 and 2020. The other key role for captivity with leadbeaters at the moment is temporary holding of possums collected from the wild, which enables us to create new pairings with animals of dispersal age, and they can then be translocated back into sites at Yellingbo and new locations elsewhere. So in the context of declining habitat condition at Yellingbo, no successful captive breeding to allow us to supplement the wild population, the population trajectory for lowland leadbeaters has been dire. The population estimate from June this year is that there are just 33 individuals surviving in the wild, which makes it one of the most threatened mammal populations in Victoria. And some recent PVA modelling completed by Dr. Joe Zilko at Monash Uni, who works in Paul Sunnick's lab, estimates that the time to extinction for this population is 11 to 23 years, unless our interventions are effective. So the clock is really ticking on how much longer this population can persist. When you overlay the population trajectories for the two species at Yellingbo, so in blue we have lowland leadbeaters possums, and in red we have helmeted honeyeaters, you can see that they're declining in parallel through the early 2000s until the point where supplementary feeding is expanded at Yellingbo. And then the honeyeater population goes through a marked, and quite dramatic increase. Supplementary feeding, so the obvious question that arises from that, why not supplementary feed the leadbeaters at Yellingbo also? Supplementary feeding programs for mammals are not quite so straightforward. There is a tendency that we tend to create restaurants and tend to attract a whole host of species in quite quickly. So this is a ringtail possum feeding at Yellingbo alongside a leadbeaters. So given the habitat condition at Yellingbo and the bushfire risk, it's very clear that we urgently need to expand the area of occupancy and also establish new populations. Yet, the history of fauna translocations is, fairly modest, and these programs continue to have challenges, and the results tend to be quite mixed and varied. Nonetheless, all of the literature is predicting that translocations will become a more common tool in conservation. And this is particularly true under climate change scenarios. And so there is an increasing group of ecologists suggesting translocation is a key management response that we need to embrace. So the recovery teams for these species and the key stakeholders working on them have spent a lot of time considering where we might establish these new populations. The assessments that we've been undertaking are informed by habitat suitability models to determine which parts of the landscape present the best translocation and best habitat restoration opportunities. So the model you're looking at was developed by Matt White at the Arthur Rylah Institute and highlights the best areas of floodplain within the range of lowland leadbeaters and helmeted honeyeaters. Arabella Eyre, who was at the University of Melbourne and now working with Zoos Victoria, has also produced habitat suitability models for leadbeaters that cover northeast Victoria. And we've spent a lot of time exploring habitat in search for translocation sites. It's the best part of my job. I get to see some amazing country and some extraordinary remote places that few people are lucky enough to venture. One of the really critical considerations in our translocation site selection relates to patch size and carrying capacity. So how many individuals can these sites support? As this is a really important influence on long-term population viability. So, for populations to be stable over time, it's essential that they support a critical mass of honeyeaters and possums. 100 individuals is probably the minimum to achieve demographic stability. And a population of this size is still likely to require occasional supplementation and would definitely require genetic management. But when we sort of do the numbers, for 100 honeyeaters, we require approximately 25 hectares of high quality habitat. And for 100 Leadbeater's possums, we require around 60 hectares of high quality habitat. And I'd stress that these values should really be viewed as minimums. When it comes to population viability, big is better. Translocation to new locations also entails a lot of consideration of potential disease risk. And so those risk assessments really require a good understanding of the health of the wild source populations. And so over recent years, the vets from Housekeeping Sanctuary have been collecting health data for both lowland leadbeaters and helmeted honeyeaters to provide that baseline and context so that we can kind of undertake these assessments. And so that health information is embedded within a much larger population monitoring program that really, for both of these species, we have the most intensive population monitoring underway for any bird or mammal in Victoria. And I can't stress enough that is a really major strength of these recovery programs. It's that detailed population data that is used to inform all of the decision making that the recovery teams undertake. And so the other kind of notable feature is that over recent years, our ability to monitor these populations has been greatly improved, particularly with remote cameras. So increasingly, we've got non-invasive techniques. At some of the new translocation sites, we're deploying camera traps in strategic positions so we can record the colour bands of birds, for instance, that visit and therefore look at survival rates and movement patterns. And this shows some similar camera footage for Leadbeater's possum. This is a family of 4 possums on night 1 following their translocation. And you'll start to see some individuals licking branches and the nest box lid. We use creamed honey to soften the ordeal for them. So the other notable feature around the monitoring programs for these 2 species is that they're supported by some of the most detailed genetic work underway for threatened species in Australia. So that's led by Professor Paul Sanix, who is part of the panel session, and his wider team at Monash University. This recovery effort, is incredibly fortunate to have had the long-term input, both from Neil Murray from La Trobe University and the current research led by Paul and Sasha Pavlova. And there's been a series of PhD students contributing to these programs. And so that research has led to a whole series of publications, in some of the leading scientific journals. And Paul, I'm sure, will expand on some of the key findings and the management implications in the panel session. But the take-home message really is that the genetic stories for these 2 species are revealing the same pattern, that as those wild populations have declined in number, significant genetic diversity has been lost. But there is good news that we are able to address this through gene pool mixing, or what we call often genetic rescue. And so this has become a really major focus of the captive breeding programs at Housekeeping Sanctuary. So through the formation of mixed pairings, we've successfully managed to incorporate genes from the most closely related subspecies of yellow-tufted honeyeater occurring in Gippsland. We've incorporated those genes into the helmeted honeyeater population to basically reinstate some of that historic diversity. For Leadbeater's possums, we're currently testing the behavioural compatibility of pairings between lowland and highland possums. When we think about managing, maintaining, restoring that genetic diversity, it really brings into focus, I guess, a vital question. And that is, how are we setting up these populations for the long term? Not just 5 years or 20 years, but how are we setting them up to contend with thousands of years? Because that is the ultimate goal, I guess, of these recovery efforts. Translocations of wildlife are not without risk, as I'm sure we all know. And, the historical literature makes it very clear that not all release sites will succeed. As we learned with the Helmeted Honeyeater releases to Bunyip State Park, where after very promising results through those early years, drought, vegetation decline had a major impact on the outcomes. For Leadbeater's possum last year, we undertook some trial translocations to Wallaby Creek in Kinglake National Park, which is shown in the red square. And despite our predictions that the dense vegetation structure at that released locality would reduce the exposure of possums to predation by foxes and cats, cat predation emerged as a really significant issue and ultimately led to the cessation of the translocation trial at that locality. So in the response of, I guess, those previous translocation attempts, during the first half of 2021, several of us have undertaken major surveys to examine the suitability of a number of potential translocation sites for both Leadbeater's and Helmeted Honeyeaters. So this map shows the sites that we've assessed for Leadbeater's possum. Those assessments are really concentrated in mountain swamp gum forest in northeast Victoria and throughout some paperbark thickets distributed across Gippsland. For the Helmeted Honeyeater, the site assessments were more concentrated really within a 50-kilometre radius of Yellingbow, owing to the presence of the other subspecies to both the north and the east. The intent of this work was really to generate a list of candidate translocation sites for each species. This step and body of work was really focused on intact forest that is ready to go now. It's proven, it's fair to say, that the assessment's pretty challenging, given the context that we have no large high-quality patches of habitat remaining throughout this area. And in contrast, Hanging Farm gives us a glimpse into the future and shows us what is possible. So this is what Hanging Farm looked like in 2018, and that's what it looks like today. So it will provide a suitable release site in the future. And once it's open to the public now, so once we emerge from lockdown, I'd urge everyone to have a visit and take a walk and look at habitat regeneration that's occurring. It's a really inspiring example of what can be achieved within a relatively short space of time, planning and adequate resourcing. And Green Australia have led this work, and in particular, Dr. Elisa Rawlings, and they've done an extraordinary job in the design of this restoration project. It highlights that we do know what to do to recover these populations, and habitat restoration is at the heart of it. And it's the floodplain of the Yarra River that presents us with a number of restoration opportunities moving forward. So when I think about the recovery efforts for these two species, there are really 4 priorities common to both. And the standout is obviously to maintain our efforts and support the populations at Yellingbow. It's critical that we increase the area of suitable habitat, both at Yellingbow and at new sites beyond Yellingbow, like Hanging Farm. We need to establish new populations through translocation, and that is a critical risk spreading measure against bushfire. And then undertaking gene pool mixing to alleviate the inbreeding in these populations is an essential requirement for the long term. I'd note that this list of priorities really just focuses on the biological components of recovery. there's an equally critical cultural and community component. And I'm sure this will come up during the panel session. And really no one is better placed than the two friends groups to lead that conversation. So those priorities really relate back to what I kind of think of as the 4 foundations of population recovery. And it's from these that we really derive our indicators of success. So habitat availability, population size and trend, the number of populations, and genetic diversity. And so when we look at how we're tracking according to those indicators, it's not going so well for lowland Leadbeater's possums, which are shown in the right-hand column. But there are a number of strengths for helmeted honeyeaters. Current population size, the expanded area of occupancy at Yellingbow, major strengths, as is the captive breeding program. Also, the early stages of the genetic rescue program for helmeted honeyeaters have been really encouraging. The notable differences between these two species are that helmeted honeyeater has a diverse and very cohesive recovery team and a successful captive breeding program in place, whereas both of these things are lacking for lowland Leadbeater's possum. The critical gaps that remain for both species relate to habitat availability and to the number of wild populations. The other, essential feature, and many people listed here are part of the recovery efforts, participating in this forum are part of the recovery efforts for these two species. But, the partnerships that are embedded throughout the programs are absolutely integral to success. No one organisation can save these species alone. And I think an important aspect for these programs is that many of the partnerships are long-standing. The significant investment by Melbourne Water into the hydrological restoration at Yellingbow is a prime example of that. I would also acknowledge over recent years the major investment into the Faunal Emblems program made by DELP and the Victorian government. And in addition, I guess some recent investment from the Australian government and the Threatened Species Commissioner's Office have really helped build on the momentum that has been created for these two species. Our strength is in the collective. And so each slide that I've shown has a story, and each story involves many people and many partners. And as we all know, people are at the heart of these recovery programs. It's been the Friends of Helmeted Honeyeater and the Friends of Leadbeater's Possum that have really been at the heart of bringing people together. And so I would certainly acknowledge their enormous contributions. I'm sure the two people in this slide are well known to most people who've hooked in, Bruce Quinn and Bob Anderson. A striking feature of the Helmeted Honeyeater and Leadbeaters is that they've always drawn people to them. And, I guess with the longevity of these programs, we've lost also, some dear friends along the way. So we had David Blair shown and also Steve Craig. And, many people have made significant contributions. It's a long list, Margot Craddock, Bob Taylor, John Seaback, and Pam Miskin, Peter Rawlinson, and others. All right, shifting to highland leadbeaters in the Central Highlands. So there's been a huge amount of work undertaken during the past 8 years, particularly the extensive camera trapping surveys led by the Arthur Eiler Institute. However, the absence of a recovery team has really meant that we haven't had coordination among the different initiatives underway. And the action statement and the recovery plan for Leadbeater's possum is long out of date and really needs some renewal. What we know is that the combination of fire and logging during the past 80 years, and really since that 1939 Black Friday wildfire that burnt 80% of the highlands, have drastically altered the age structure of the forest throughout the highlands. You know, we've had a major shift from multi-aged forest to young forest. And so one of the standout consequences of that is that old trees with hollows upon which an entire wildlife community depend are greatly reduced in abundance and are now too scarce. We also know there will be more fires, you know, and climate change will exacerbate this, and habitat recovery can be slow. You know, so this is an image of Lake Mountain 10 years after Black Saturday, and the impacts are still pretty devastating. The 2019-2020, Black Summer fires demonstrate the scale and the speed of change that can occur. And those fires really emphasize that forest-dependent wildlife populations are going to need large undisturbed forests over substantial areas greater than our current reserve system if they are to contend with what is to come. Whether we're talking about wet forest or swamp forest, it's the same. You know, it's the provision of high quality habitat that is the key to the long-term persistence of these populations. So how we manage the land, what happens to the land, will ultimately determine what happens to these species. And I'd stress that both local and landscape scales matter. And so all of our recovery efforts are underpinned by the importance of place. You know, we attempt to inspire people about the species really in order to care more about place. And so forming connections with patches of land is integral to our success. It's about how we care for these patches of land. That ethos is epitomized by the Friends groups, and I particularly acknowledge Alan Clayton and Steve Meacher, whose efforts to honour and protect place are surpassed by none. If we think about time, 50 years to restore these populations in drastically altered landscapes doesn't actually seem surprising or unreasonable, given we've had more than a century of habitat loss and modification that's preceded us. I also think there's a trap that people sometimes think that great conservation stories always occur elsewhere and occur abroad, but we are living it here. These two species are the focus of some of the highest quality and most intensive population and restoration management initiatives underway anywhere. And I think we can all be proud of that. So there's much to be optimistic about, but we do need to recognize that we are searching for solutions in compromised landscapes. There's a lot of work ahead of us and much work to be done, but we will recover these species, but it is going to take time and it will take many of us. And I think a really important ongoing challenge is for us all to make more people care. Right, nearly at the end, but I realize I haven't shown many videos of the two species throughout. So here it goes. These are lowland leadbeaters at Yellingbo. The juveniles are rather adorable. I'm sure Bruce is trying to record all the band combinations. And so to finish, I thought we would end as we started, with some time travel. And so again, I'm going to ask you all to close your eyes. And this time we're going to move into the future. And I want you to dream. So imagine it's the year 2070, 50 years from now. Where are the places you envisage helmeted honeyeaters and leadbeaters will occur? What do those populations look like in abundance? How extensive is the forest cover? What do the forests look like? Okay, back to you, Alan. Thank you, everyone.
Alan, I think you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Dan. You can see why Dan was the obvious choice for giving that overview. And I think to everybody, it is so evident that for Dan, threatened species conservation's both a passion and a vocation. And I'm reminded of the old Quaker definition of vocation as being where the heart's desire meets the world's need. And I'm not sure that being up at 4 a.m. in sub-zero temperatures monitoring leadbeater's possums would necessarily equate to the heart's desire, but the commitment that Dan shows to these endangered and critically endangered species is absolutely something that qualifies as meeting the world's need. And we'll pick up in the next session of the symposium some of the threads that Dan has presented to us. And what you gave us, Dan, was such a nuanced, informative, thought-provoking overview. And in the tradition of showing some video, as a postscript to Dan's presentation, we might reintroduce you to the other formal emblem, as we did to one at the beginning of this, and this is the Leadbeater's possum. And our guide to this is the knowledgeable, energetic and committed Joe Antrobus from Parks Victoria.
Beautiful, magnificent mountain ash forest in the Central Highlands at Mount Donabew, which is home to our state faunal emblem, the Leadbeater's possum. My name's Joe Antrobus. I'm the District Operations Coordinator for Parks Victoria for Dandenong Ranges Yarra Ranges District, which mostly covers the Central Highlands of Victoria. The Leadbeater's possum is absolutely gorgeous. It's a small possum, weighs less than an apple. It would fit in the palm of your hand, big round eyes. Also been known in the past as a fairy possum because it likes to flit through the forest. It's a very elusive species. First specimen was collected in 1867. By 1960, it had not been seen in the wild for 50 years, so the government declared that it was extinct. Interestingly, it was rediscovered in 1961 in the forest near Marysville, but unfortunately it's endangered and was more recently upgraded to critically endangered. The Leadbeater's possum are really reliant on hollows for shelter at night to help keep them away from predators, to have warmth, somewhere to breed, somewhere to have their young. Mountain ash forests, and particularly Eucalyptus regnans, are really important for that. The really challenging thing for the leadbeater's possum is that for a mountain ash tree to develop a hollow suitable for leadbeaters, it takes at least 190 to 200 years. Unsustainable logging practices and bushfires take out the trees, the mountain ash trees, so they don't get to develop hollows. With climate change, we're more likely to get regular high-intensity fires. We're getting more extremes in temperature, so that impacts on how hot they burn and what area they cover. When they get severely burnt, trees collapse and don't get to form hollows, which means hollows are in great shortage in the landscape. Science is really, really important for that because they can't tell us what they need, but if we study them and we do the research and the monitoring, the evidence is really clear. And at the moment, the evidence is showing that they're critically endangered, and I think we all should be doing something to try and address that. Parks Victoria is one of many project partners that are working to try and conserve and improve habitat for leadbeater's possums. We're doing a lot of monitoring of the possums, so trying to understand where they occur. To monitor a really elusive species, it's really important to use science as much as we can. So there's a number of really important tools we use. One is a thermal camera. Rather than using bright lights, we can just use a thermal camera and detect a heat signal. We often put remote cameras.
Well, thank you for that encapsulated overview, Joe, I think, who is with us today. And that brings us to our halfway point. And we probably in need of a stretch, some hydration and the like. So we'll take a 4-minute break and be back here by 3:09. So
excuse me, Alan.
yes,
it's Bruce. Yeah, is Em sharing my slide, or do I need to do that?
No. We won't be doing the slide, Bruce.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. No worries. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Fisheries and Wildlife Division, for whom I started working, had this reserve as their primary emphasis was on management of game reserves, and the concept of a nature reserve for an endangered species was something rather unusual. But it's always struck me one of the things that's really interesting about it is the kind of human dimension to this, and why is this bird of particular importance, and why would we be doing this? And I remember very well as a young bloke working at Yellingbo, I used to get work done on my car by a mechanic in Seville, and he dropped me off at the reserve one day when I dropped my car in there. And when I went to pick my car up again, he said, "What the hell are you guys doing out there? What's this all about? Why is this bird so important?" And I confess I was rather confronted by that question, to be honest, and I've thought about it long and hard since. And in some respects, it's a yellow-tufted honeyeater. Its forehead feathers are a couple of millimetres longer than other yellow-tufted honeyeaters. And so in a sense, we might say, well, why is it that important? But the reality is that it's an icon. It's become an icon species or an umbrella species, which people can get their mind around and put their focus to. And as a consequence, so back at that stage, we didn't know that Eucalyptus camphora even existed in the reserve. We thought it was Eucalyptus ovata. The concept of it being a very threatened ecosystem in its own right was something we weren't even aware of. And then as a consequence, subsequently, we found things like swamp skink, and I noticed Marnie Rawlinson's in the room. That's a species that is of real interest to me. But subsequently finding leadbeaters there, all of these things which we had no concept of, and so in a sense the bird has actually been a focus for attention. And I think it was Bob Anderson many years ago said to me, if we had gone to the broader community and said it's really important that we conserve the eucalyptus camphora sedge-rich swamp community, would we have a massive effort that we've had in the last few decades? And I take enormous pride in actually seeing what has occurred, but also the fact that this bird and Leadbeater's possum themselves are icons and umbrella species, and as a consequence, all of this has flowed from that, and the capacity to maintain a very important ecosystem has come out of that as well.
Thanks for that, Ian, and I think we'll also address what else is in the reserve apart from the helmeted honeyeaters and Leadbeater's possum. Gay Gadsden, you've also been around the reserve for a long time. Is there anything you would like to add to this?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I was the first coordinator with Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater back in the early 90s, and have returned at the end of my career to head up the Beyond Yellingbow program. And I guess, you know, from the perspective of what's happening with on-ground works to protect and improve habitat, I look at the, you know, what's happened in the last 5 years since I've been back, and just the number of partners that are working together and the amount of activity that's going into habitat protection and restoration is just, you know, many-fold on what was happening in the early 90s. And Dan mentioned some of those things, you know, Faunal Emblems fundings means that Parks Victoria have some money to do something in the reserve to improve habitat. Deer control, I think, is making a really big difference, both on public and private land. The additions to the reserve, hydrological restorations, large-scale plantings, all of these things have been just going ahead in leaps and bounds. And I think, you know, something else that Dan alluded to was the fact that the government agencies, the NGOs, the community groups just work together so well. And the Yarra for Life group that's facilitated by Casey on our panel is a real cornerstone for making that happen. And just the amount of cooperation and how we help each other to achieve our goals is, you know, we're really, really kicking some goals now in that space.
Steve Meachie, this might sound like nirvana for you, because the situation of the Leadbeater's possum, both the lowland variety in Yellingbow and the highland variety in the Central Highlands, are facing a different trajectory. Dan has touched on some of those issues. What would you like to add to what Dan has said?
Well, thanks, Alan. Yes, I wouldn't so much say they're on a different trajectory, but if we don't do something about it, we will find that the Highlands Leadbeater's possums are essentially on a different part of the same trajectory. We know, for instance, from the Vago report that came out this week, that it's a downward trajectory. And that's what we're fighting against. Since Leadbeater's possum was rediscovered in 1961, it's been clear that there is a clash between the forest industry and the Leadbeater's possum. The industry likes the regrowth forest, and in particular, the 1939 regrowth, which at 82 years old now, is in their view ripe for logging. And that's exactly the same sort of forest that Leadbeater's possum needs in the Highlands to survive. The regrowth forest, as long as there is big old hollow bearing trees in amongst the regrowth forest in which the animals can den and breed. So that's the clash we've actually been facing for the last 60 years, and we're now nearing the end game. So we need to look at the issue of forestry. The forest industry says, oh, logging isn't the issue, it's fire. But as Dan mentioned earlier, fire and logging are now understood to be closely related. And we know that disturbed forest is more at risk of high intensity fires. And because of the logging history of the Central Highlands, it's all been disturbed in the last 40 or so years, which puts it at increased risk of fire. So we have to bear in mind all those things, and we have to band together and pay attention to the Vago report from this week and say this is not good enough. Together, we must stand up and demand improvements.
Yep. Thanks for that, Steve. And I think that those comments really set an overall perspective, and perhaps we could drill down onto some of those elements. When I'm asked about the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater, I sometimes say that it stands on three pillars: a healthy place, a healthy bird, and healthy organisation. And for this discussion, it would be healthy habitat, healthy species, and healthy partnerships. So let's start with habitat and start with Yellingbow. Melanie Birchnell, what is it special about the habitat at the Yellingbow Reserve, and what are its strengths and what are its vulnerabilities?
Thanks, Alan. Oh, what a great symposium so far. I'm blown away by it. Thanks, Dan, for your keynote speech too. Within Yellingbow Nature Conservation Reserve, there's a unique assemblage of ecosystems within the riparian area and beyond that fringe that riparian area. And regrettably, it's a unique structure and set of processes compared to the surrounding landscape. So that's one of its strengths. A particularly unique element within the reserve is the sedge-rich Eucalyptus camphora swamp, which we've heard a little about today. This vegetation community and the processes that enable that community to persist here provide critical habitat for the last naturally occurring population of helmeted honeyeaters and the lowland genetics form of the Leadbeater's possum. As well, the surrounding vegetation types that support other rare and threatened species are dependent on that riparian or that swamp system. And in some ways, Yellingbow Nature Conservation Reserve's major strength is also its vulnerability, its greatest vulnerability. It's a remnant patch of unique vegetation in a landscape that has been significantly modified. So the strength is that it has persisted in the landscape after practically all other similar habitat has been cleared or drained, modified out of its habitat value or burnt. Within the historic range of the helmeted honeyeater and the lowland genetics of the Leadbeater's possum. The vulnerability then is that Yellingbow Nature Conservation Reserve is now a series of long, narrow fingers that are an island in a sea of white noise as far as these taxa are concerned. It is subject to a range of edge effects like pest plants and animals, increased wind and therefore drying and so fire risk, increased pollutants, particularly off adjoining land as nutrients are running off into the swamp and the creek systems, altered hydrological inputs and more. Also, it sits in an increasingly domesticated catchment context, which creates a range of vulnerabilities for habitat and for the processes that operate within the reserve. The most notable of these stems from hydrology. As the runoff within the catchment increases and the surrounding land is cleared, the volume and velocity of the water entering the reserve increases. As well as carrying its own sediment, these waters gouge out local creeks and ephemeral drainage lines, as anyone who's worked in the reserve has witnessed, and that brings more sediment that clogs the systems in some places, while simultaneously channelizing the systems, preventing engagement with the floodplain. So we're not seeing as regular engagement with the floodplain, and as Bruce indicated, that's having impacts on that floodplain's ability to regenerate. So it has two major impacts. The water doesn't sit in the system for very long as it's sort of rushing out of the system further out into the catchment, lower down in the catchment, and it sits in the wrong places. And therefore doesn't initiate the flood-dependent processes that restore diversity, structure, and diverse age classes. Of course, one of its huge strengths is that it's a conservation reserve, as Ian pointed out, managed in a way that benefits our faunal emblems rather than like most other reserves, rather than being managed for human benefits, which is really important. And through programs like Beyond Yellingbow and Parks Victoria's Good Neighbours program, the local community is learning and caring more to be part of the solution. Also, there's been so much research and monitoring, as Dan indicated. It would be amongst the best researched and monitored taxa in the world. DELP and Sue's citizen science programs, Melbourne and Monash Uni's research, and many others. So these are really great strengths within the reserve. Thanks.
Fantastic. If it was an exam question, I think the markers would give you 9.988 out of 10 on that. So Ian Smales, I was going to ask, is there anything you would add to that? I'm not sure whether there is.
Not a lot, but I would say that while we've learned a great deal and we're continuing to learn a great deal, we still have so much that we don't know. And one of the things that strikes me is that we actually don't know anything really, unfortunately, about whether Indigenous people managed this particular ecosystem in any way, or any of the things that they did affected it. But also we do have some information about European management. And so prior to the establishment of the reserve, the local landowners, as I remember being told back in the 1970s, in the 1950s and 60s, used to burn the Phragmites swamp patches in the summer to put their cattle in, to provide, because it promoted green feed for the cattle. So there are things like that. So we don't really know, for instance, whether the camphora was promoted as a result of that kind of management, if that's what we can call it, and is of a particular age structure because of those sorts of interventions. And so we really need to keep on learning and keep an open mind, and just see whatever we can learn further about it.
Thank you. So, I mean, in this discussion, we've focused on the Helmeted Honeyeater and the Leadbeater's possum. Sue Tardif, you and your husband, Bruce Tardif, have spent many hundreds of hours, maybe thousands of hours in the reserve. What are some of the flora and fauna, some of which are endangered and threatened, that you might encounter there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alan, and thank you, everyone. I'd like to go back for just a second and just recap that Dan in his presentation mentioned that the answer to the Helmeted Honeyeater and the Leadbeater's possum recovery in the reserve is really, and outside the reserve in the Highlands, is about making people care. And that's a big part of the solution going forward for these species. And what we absolutely know with certainty is that people love these two particular animals, but they also connect really strongly to other parts of the natural world. And often those things that they connect to are quite small and quite insignificant, in themselves, but they're part of a really huge picture when it comes to whether a threatened species will survive into the future. So what we're very focused on as a friends group is that we're very firmly focused on all of the species that coexist with the Helmeted Honeyeater and the Leadbeater's possum. They do not exist in isolation, and they never will. They'll die, like they won't persist. So, and as Ian was saying, there's so much to learn about what is coexisting with these species. We certainly know a lot about that, but we certainly don't know it all. And what we're very conscious of as a community group, as a friends group, is that often a lot of that information is tied up, I suppose, in lists and scientific research articles, and it's fabulous, but it's also quite inaccessible to the community. And so what we're doing as a friends group is really visualising it. so that the things that people really connect to, whether that's a spider, whether it's fungi, whether it's the orchids, whether it's the the little insects, the ladybirds, all of those amazing things in our ecosystem that are so important to the health of that ecosystem. We're wanting people to really visualize what we're talking about when we're talking about the science of helmeted honeyeater and Leadbeater's possum recovery. So behind me is just a really small snapshot of some of the species within the reserve. And these are species that people in our community, our volunteers, have thought, wow, look at that, like that's amazing. And what you might notice about those images, and that is a tiny snapshot of the species within the reserve, is that there isn't a helmeted honeyeater in it and there isn't a Leadbeater's possum in it. But people are connecting very much to the fungi that is enabling the plant to grow, that is enabling a place for the helmeted honeyeater to build a nest. So the interconnectedness is really important. So so in regards to the species that we know about, there's real richness within these little pockets of land that remain, that are intact bushland. They're so important to conserve. And what we know with certainty, because we've been in this reserve system for a long, long time, as Ian has been saying, we have lots to learn, but what we also know that within this reserve, there are at least 100 species of plant that are significant to this Yarra Ranges Council area. And they're vulnerable to extinction. They're certainly vulnerable to extinction locally, and some of them are vulnerable to extinction in Australia. We also know very firmly that there are at least 25 faunal species within the reserve that are very significant to this area. And again, they're vulnerable to extinction. Some of the ones that people have been in the reserve for many, many years longer than I have never seen. And it was a joy to take someone who was day one in the reserve, or when the Friends Group formed in 1989, to see for the first time a particular orchid that exists within the reserve. Sometimes you don't even know. Yeah.
Sue, I might thank you so much again. The examiners have given you 9.98 out of that. And all those answers have been stressing the importance of habitat in all its forms. And one of the prime roles of the Friends has been the restoration of degraded habitat and turning previously cleared pasture land into suitable habitat, and has helped in that by operating the nursery that produces the 90,000 plants indigenous to the area each year. And so over the past 3 decades, the Friends have overseen the planting of more than 2 million trees, shrubs, grasses and sedges. And this has often been, and again, it's the pattern that Dan alluded to, the partnership with groups, including Parks Victoria, Melbourne Water and the CMA. Casey Melfi from the CMA, can you explain some of the mechanics and dynamics of this, and perhaps with a site like Barungba Bik, a name which there was consultation with the Wurundjeri Tribe Council to give it that name. So Casey, perhaps if you could indicate what that restoration of habitat might mean.
Yeah, I guess Barungba Bik is a really great example of how a bunch of people and organisations have come together to work on habitat restoration. I guess that collaboration and working together has been a big theme of today. So sort of bear with me as I run through the long list of people that have worked on Barungba Bik. So as Alan said, Barungba Bik is a Wurundjeri Woiwurrung name, meaning misty lands. So if anybody has ever been to Yellingbo in the winter, they'll recognise the mist that falls in these low-lying areas. So Bromabik was a back paddock, a horse paddock of a property that adjoined the Yellingbo Nature Conservation Reserve. And the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater had been looking over the fence of this back paddock for quite some time. So as it turns out, it wasn't very good as a horse paddock because it was low-lying, it was often quite wet, and whenever the Warriallock Creek flooded, it was covered in a sheet of water for some time. But for these exact reasons that made it not a great horse paddock, it makes it really excellent for habitat restoration opportunities in terms of the types of vegetation that the Helmeted Honeyeater and Leadbeater's possum are looking for. So in collaboration with Trust for Nature, the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater went and knocked on their landholder's front door and said, hey, what about that back paddock? And after many cups of tea around the kitchen table and walks through the paddock, the landholders agreed to sell that piece of land and have it reinstated into the reserve system so it would become part of the
Casey,
nature
I'm
conservation.
sorry to interrupt. I might get you to do more the elevator pitch. I'm sorry, not wanting to. We've got to traverse a bit of ground.
Yeah, I'll sum it up. So I guess a summary would be that a collaboration of state funding, Australian government funding, money from Suze Victoria, the amazing efforts of volunteers, school groups, corporate groups, and Trust for Nature, we've heard, has been quite vital in securing these pieces of land over the years. We had what was a horse paddock is now looking like an amazing piece of habitat. You would have seen some of the pictures that Dan had in his video of what Hayning Farm looks like. So it's starting to look like that now. So from a horse paddock that was just grasses and trunked all over, we have trees now in less than 18 months that are taller than me, and it's looking fantastic. So I guess it's a good example of how collaboration and how lots of people chipping in little bits and pieces or not so little bits and pieces has changed this landscape quite significantly in a relatively short period of time. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. And we've been largely talking about public land, and Gai Gadsden, you've been overseeing a program that's engaging with private landholders. This has been hailed as an exemplary model by many, including the Threatened Species Commissioner. Can you give us an encapsulated summary of that program?
Alan, Gai actually has just lost power at her house.
Right.
Yeah, so she may or may not be able to rejoin via her phone. But yeah, perhaps we can hold that question in case she's able to join us again.
I will give the very quick summation, and that is, if you look at the Yellingbo Reserve, it's 661 hectares in size, and over a 4-year period, Gai has overseen a program that protects around 309 hectares of high quality habitat, wildlife habitat land on private land, is restoring 15.5 hectares of degraded habitat and is converting 7 hectares of pasture land into a quality habitat. Also, the level of engagement, 91 properties, is off the chart when you look at the national and international literature of landholder engagement. So I think we'll move to the second pillar, and that is healthy species. Paul Sunnix, we've been keeping you a bit on ice until now. We have the situation at Yellingbo of a small maroon populations of 2 species. What are the genetic consequences of this situation?
Thanks, everyone. This is great. If a small population is kept isolated, it loses genetic variation, which has 3 really bad consequences. First is for individuals who become unfit and unhealthy. The second is that the population as a whole loses capabilities. And the third is that it loses the ability to evolve into the future. And I know that you want the elevator pitch. So people might think, oh yes, that's a problem, you know, maybe that'll worry us in 100 years or 1,000 years. The most inbred helmeted honeyeaters can only expect to have 2.5 offspring in a lifetime, whereas the most outbred one, the least inbred ones, can expect to have 27. So 10 times as many offspring. It's not some little sort of fiddly thing around the edge. And so that's why it's such a core bit of what you're talking about, Alan. Healthy birds, they need everything else in place, but they also need good genetics.
Well, what do we have in our toolkit to address that situation?
Well, in many species, we would have the ability to, if we've identified a genetic problem and we've set our goal as wanting to fix it, we would have the luxury of being able to go to another population of very much the same kind of organism. In the case of he-hoes, as everyone knows, until extremely recently, it was the last population, and well done to everyone involved in it not being the very last the only population. But we could have gone to a different population. That's not on the cards for he-hoes, and so the gene flow that we need to restore the genetic health of he-hoes has to come from their cousins. And so my brilliant team, who you introduced before, Alan, have done all the legwork on figuring out which are the appropriate source populations to think about that from. And that's now being implemented by all the amazing partners involved in this program. So restoring appropriate genetic variation is the key take-home message, and then growing the population as fast as possible.
So what are the, some people might say this is a bit like playing God. So what are the issues that you keep in mind in terms of making sure this is a caring and benign God, if we had to use that analogy? So what could potentially go wrong and how do you guard against it?
Well, I don't think of it as playing God at all, particularly in this case. I think of it as unplaying humans. All we're really doing is turning back the clock a little while, like a few decades, to before human impact actually ended up in the situation that we're in. And so one of the key things that Catherine, Sasha, and now Deanna have been doing was figuring out sort of what was the natural situation, asking the right questions about how do we make the best decisions going forward, and then weighing those up in the context. And it turns out that the natural situation was that he-hoes used to interbreed with the neighboring subspecies Gippslandicus a lot more than they do now. And so without playing God at all, we've got a total validation to increase the level of gene flow, at least back to what it used to be, and see if we can fix the inbreeding problems that we know are so acute, such that they effectively kill 90% of helmeted honeyeaters for the most inbred birds. Obviously, we'd want to build some safeguards into that, and we do that in a number of ways. Make sure that we ask the right questions, which is, it involves not being risk averse and being conservative, thinking that you're being safe by being conservative. Dan highlighted in his talk that doing nothing is a choice with consequences. And we know what doing nothing is going to do for he-ho. They will go extinct very, very fast. And so if your conservation goal is to not have extinction, you've got to be brave and make some decisions. And those decisions involve identifying Gippslandicus is the best subspecies to have some gene flow from, deciding what's a good amount to have and then how that can be practically implemented, and then doing that in a learning by doing context, so an adaptive management context. So you monitor carefully, make sure that you like the way things are tracking. If you don't like how things are going, you can tweak them. And if you do like them, you make sure that you keep going and do more of the same.
Good.
And we know enough to make this work and make it safe. We just have to be brave and smart.
Thank you very much. And I think that now we understand. I mean, the one thing that's seared on my cerebellum from what you said some years ago is that if we did everything else right and we didn't address the genetic situation, there was a 89% likelihood of the helmeted honeyeater going extinct simply from inbreeding depression. And I think time is against us, and we probably need to move to our third pillar, which is what in some areas would be called social capital, and what Dan stressed in terms of the partnerships. And for both the friends groups, an active and vibrant volunteer base is their absolute lifeblood. So Sue Tart, if you're the coordinator of volunteers for the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater, what's been the role and impact of volunteers, and in a short summation?
Sorry, it's been immense over the decades. And prior to the intensive recovery programs happening, volunteers were in the background there doing incredible things. The reserve system was proclaimed because of the power of volunteer effort. It was recognised around 1989 by a government employee, Steve Craig, that we very much honour in the Friends group. He acknowledged that government employees can't do it all. They need community to get involved, and they need the force and the power of volunteers to enable change in the projection of species that are in trouble. And so volunteers get involved in all sorts of things. You kind of name it and they're there. Yeah, often in the background, and they make us as employees look really good. So yeah, we would encourage you to jump onto the Friends of the Leadbeater's Possum website, or the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater's website, and have a look at the types of volunteering opportunities you can get involved in.
Steve Meacher, what is something you'd say on this perspective from the Friends of the Leadbeaters?
I'd say yes, volunteers are incredibly important with these organisations, even more so over the last 20 years as governments have defunded their own departments and handed some of the responsibilities onto volunteer groups. There are things that volunteers are doing now, like monitoring species, like applying for uplisting of species to higher grades and so on, or even getting species listed, because the government no longer is allowing resources for those processes to occur. So it's incredibly important. But I'd also say that volunteers shouldn't be having to do some of the work we're doing. And I'm thinking here particularly about the court case that Friends of Leadys currently has, headed for the High Court. The foundation of that court case was monitoring work or surveying work being done by volunteers in the forest. It shouldn't be that volunteer groups are having to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to take the government to court. If the government was doing its job properly, that's something that volunteers wouldn't have to take on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do have to have one eye to the clock. So I might ask Melanie Birchnell to perhaps talk on behalf of both organisations about what can people do to support the work of the two groups.
Oh, thanks. Well, I mean, there's obvious things like tell the story that you've heard here. Part of the puzzle, as Dan said, is to help people care. So if you care and you've heard things here that are really of interest to you, or you know things from your own experience of being a volunteer out in the reserve or whatever it might be, share the stories. The stories are the thing that connect people to place and to these organisms, these animals, and to conservation more broadly. So if you can tell the story, then you will help connect people to their caring. Get involved as a member or a volunteer of either of these amazing friends groups. You can hear that there's a whole gamut of different ways to get involved, and there's a whole heap of jobs behind the scenes as well. There's a committee that is just incredible. There are, all kinds of ways to volunteer. You can join in with the citizen science work that Sue's been talking about, and that is part of a much, much broader citizen science context. You can make a donation. Both the friends groups have really easy platforms to make donations through Give Now. So in either of the cases, you could go to the website and find details on how to make a donation. And as you can hear from today, your support on that front really makes a difference too. There are other ways you can choose more broadly to reduce your ecological footprint, and remember that Earth is our life support system. I think that's something that we, as humans in this current age of just forgetting more and more, Earth is our life support system, and we need to look after it as such and engage with it as such. Any and all of these things make a difference. And last but not least, choose some awesome Christmas presents or surprise someone with a random gift in lieu of a visit that you can't make at the moment. And Em's going to just queue up the Friends of the Leadbeater's Possum merchandise video. So sweet. Thanks to Adam for that. And just briefly, here is the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater. Hopefully you can see that slide just there. All kinds of different things on option, and most of them, all of them are wonderful. So there's all kinds of ways you can get involved. There'd be a million more that I haven't thought of, but essentially it's about sharing stories and caring about conservation and caring about the processes, actually, not even conservation, but caring about the processes that underpin everything we're talking about today and underpin all of life. So yeah, that's a pretty broad reaching statement for both friends groups, but yeah, everyone has a place to play and a role to play in helping.
Yes. Thanks, Mel. And as I said, the last time we did this, we had a whole day, and unfortunately, though, our most precious non-renewable resource is time, and the allocated time has almost come to an end. And perhaps in closing, I'd ask Steve Meacher, on behalf of the Friends of the Leadbeater's Possum, to make some closing remarks.
Thanks, Alan. And first of all, I'd just like to thank Friends of Helmeted Honeyeaters for organising this event. I'd like to thank the incredible panelists. Love the work you're all doing, and more strength to your arms. So thank you for the work you're doing outside of this, but thank you for being with us this afternoon. Thank you for all the participants who I'm sure have got a lot out of this discussion. I'd like to just remind you of what Mel just said, spread the word. One of the things we often don't think of as volunteering is when you go out to your friends and family and spread these stories. But it's one of the most important things that volunteers can do, is to get this word out into the wider population. And bear in mind, in the next 9 months, we're going to have a federal election. In the next 18 months, no, just over 12 months now, there's going to be a state election. Make sure your politicians and all the candidates know that you care about these issues and it will affect your vote. Okay, that's one of the most important things you can do. This is the time when politicians are vulnerable to us, the electorate. So make sure your voice is heard. Make sure you know that they're not doing well enough. And again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Steve. And in closing, I would endorse all those remarks and in fact, hark back to what the mention at the beginning of this area about the Auditor General's report. And because I think it's sometimes, and I believe truly said, that the mark of a civilized society is how it treats and deals with the most marginalised and disadvantaged in that society. And that's talking about human society. But what about what my friend, the late Susanna Brindle, called in a fairly influential monograph, The More Than Human World, is the idea that there should be a regime of protection for the almost infinite manifestations of life in that world, especially the most vulnerable and exposed in the form of those on the cusp of extinction, some form of utopian fantasy. And I think that the answer that it's not was that back in 1988, the Kane Labor government enacted the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, which was designed to protect species, genetic material and habitats, to prevent extinction and to allow the maximum genetic diversity possible within Victoria, not for a limited number of years, but for perpetuity. And what I would assert that actually established a covenant between us as a society and the more than human world, somewhat akin to the R2P, the responsibility to protect in doctrine and international law, and what Steve was saying about holding politicians to account. And the answer is often that this is a lot of money. Well, we've seen $14.8 billion spent on level crossings removal, which is something which is important, but there is also a complex ecological infrastructure. And I would simply say to those who say it costs too much money, a reference that our panel member Paul Sunix brought to my attention in an article in the prestigious journal Science, where a distinguished group of scholars from many disciplines, and they were headed up by Donald McCarthy, an Irish statistician and chairperson of the UN Statistical Commission, that we could have programs where to preserve all taxa, preventing their extinction of all known species, improve their conservation status, and keep protected about 17% of terrestrial and inland waters for 20% of the annual global consumer spending on soft drinks. So I would echo absolutely what Steve has said. We are able to find the resources, as we've found during COVID, and we need to honour our covenantal duty to protect the myriad of members of Susanna Brindle's More Than Human World, and we need to hold our elected representatives to account to do that. The final part of our program today is to launch the online exhibition, which is chiefly devoted to the works of depicting the Leadbeater's possum and the Helmeted Honeyeater. And this was to be held in 2 galleries at Beringia Cultural Centre. And I would like to acknowledge the work that was done with Gareth Hart, the CEO of Beringia, and JD Mittman, who is the curator, wonderful curator. We're hoping to have that back, and we'll transition to the exhibition opening with an excerpt from the acclaimed Australian composer, Dr. Jane Hammond, and her new work, Songs of the Helmeted Honeyeater. Wow. Isn't that just something fantastic? And when things open up, I really recommend that you look out for performances of Jane Hammond's Songs of the Helmeted Honeyeaters, which is an amazing oral and visual treat, because you have virtuoso pianist Cody Green along with Justin Keneally on saxophone, and the narration with the ethereal voice of Teresa Borg, and the exquisite cinematography of Angus Hamilton. The second thing I would recommend is look out for the La Mama website for M. Chandler's production of the story Keepers, which I think is happening in February. M, who's done the background work for this symposium. And thirdly, keep an eye out on the Beringia Cultural Centre website for when we hope to get together with Gareth and JD and have an actual exhibition in the round 3D. So without being able to do that at the moment, we can have a teaser and we'll go to the just a taste of what you will see in the actual exhibition, but what you will see, and also a taste of what is a virtual exhibition. The link to is at the end of this, and I'll also send out to everyone present a link to that virtual exhibition. And in bringing the virtual exhibition to fruition, it's been the fruit of the labours of two talented individuals. The curator is in cyberspace is Marita Hannigan, herself a practicing artist, and the all-round digital genius of Adam Fletcher from Dinosaurus. So let's roll the preview for the exhibition. Well, I think that's more than a teaser, and as one of the graphic shows, there are works for sale from a number of very well-known wildlife artists. This marks the end of this symposium. Thank you very much to everyone who's attended and to the members of the 50th anniversary planning committee who assisted putting this together. Thank you to M. Chandler for technical support. And if there's any other information, please go to the web pages and Facebook pages of the Friends of the Helmeted Honey and the Friends of the Leadbeater's Possum. And till we meet again in person, stay safe. Thank you and farewell.